Well, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. There are two state and local accomplishments panel, and we wanted this to be more conversational, but obviously it's a weird panel setup. So this is the best we can do. So we'll try to make it a little less formal and a lot more conversational. So there is a little bit of a structure, but everyone can jump in and answer questions and add whatever you think is valuable to this panel. So I want to start off with a quick introduction and just give you all a quick overview of both the Antioch project and the Contra Costa project, and sort of the differences between them in terms of how they got started and their funding, and introduce you to the panel. So to my far left, we have Captain Diane Aguinaga, Police Captain for the Antioch Police Department. We have to my direct left Dante Blue, who's the Deputy Director for the Contra Costa County Office of Reentry and Justice. And then to my right, we have Ellen McDonald, who is the Deputy Public Defender with the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office. And so you see we have both Contra Costa and Antioch up here, and part of that is there was an Antioch project that was started in July of 2016, and that project focused on counsel at pre-arraignment, meaning when individuals first had contact with law enforcement, the law enforcement system, there was a system in place to engage the public defender's office. The Antioch program was funded through a state and local funds that we'll talk about, and has helped over 1,200 people since its inception, and it has reduced the failure to appear rate from 57% to 27% in that time. So in October of 2016, that year, Contra Costa was then selected in an additional round of funding under what was then the Smart Defense Initiative to do a similar project in Richmond. And so since February of this year, when it really got started, they have helped over 450 people and reduced their failure to appear rate from 52% to 17%. So if you want more details on the Contra Costa site itself, we have materials over at the registration desk from the NLADA has provided as a training and technical assistance provider for those sites. So you can learn a lot more about both Contra Costa and our other sites. But today we're going to talk a little bit about how these collaborations started, how these setups started. They're very uniquely designed and what they've accomplished, how these were actually funded, which is also a really interesting story, because they obviously have federal funds to do some of this work, but they didn't start with our federal funds, actually. And what financial resources are sort of available to them moving forward, both with when the DOJ funding runs out and with their local funding. So the first question I have, which any of you can answer, but I'm uniquely interested in the law enforcement sort of perspective on this, is what was it like first getting the Antioch project set up and engaging with these different partners? So when they sort of come to the law enforcement partner in this and start this conversation, like how does it go and how are you sold on even getting involved?
So for our public defender's office, probably like most public defender's offices, we had never had a partnership with a law enforcement agency. And when we first conceived of this program, our initial focus was obviously on closing that gap in representation, and so that those that were indigent could have an attorney from the first moment after they're cited or have law enforcement contact. And I'd like to say the chief from Antioch, which is a city in the eastern part of Contra Costa County. Contra Costa is in the Bay Area of California, Northern California. The chief, when our head public defender talked about this idea at a roundtable of leaders in our county, was really enthusiastic about having his department participate in this. And since at that time, and then we started doing trainings with the department, had several meetings with Diane and others. It's just been really a wonderful partnership. It's taken us kind of outside of our traditionally adversarial roles to find some common ground and to work together. And I think for all of us, it's been a real breakthrough. We've started to, get to know each other in a different context. And, the Antioch Police Department has been really wonderful to work with. Kind of a win-win for everyone. For us, we're able to really get information that helps us link up with people from the moment they're cited by the police department and work with them very closely. And from law enforcement side, they're able to free up resources from whether that be resources from arresting people on bench warrants for missing their court dates. They're able to free up, resources as well for working on those low-level cases. So for us, it's been a really good partnership.
So I just want to ask if you can give like a 60-second overview of how it works between you and the law enforcement department.
Sure. So the idea is that, again, we're going to make contact with people that are cited from the moment of their citation or as quickly thereafter. So weekly, our early representation staff, and we have one lawyer and one legal assistant that work on the Antioch program. Every week they go over and get a stack of the citations. And so these are people on lower level misdemeanor cases that are cited by law enforcement, not arrested, but cited on their cases. And then our staff work to make contact with people both based on the contact information in the citations from law enforcement, and people can contact us. And a critical piece of this is that Diane and her staff have been willing to give cards to people at the moment of police contact, letting them know that these resources are available, that they can contact our early representation program, and that they can reach out and be connected with the lawyer early on. So obviously some of what we provide is legal advice. Part of this is demystifying the court process, letting people know what the filing process is like, which in our county can be lengthy, and sometimes charges aren't filed right away. So it was creating a situation with a high number of failures to appear. Unfortunately, we've been able to reduce that quite a bit.
Good morning. And I think on the law enforcement side, when I first met with Ellen, the key was that what they were asking was not unreasonable of our department and of our officers. The card that we developed over time was easy for a police officer to carry in his pocket and to give out to the people that we cited. The other key, I think, that made it more appealing or made it easier was that the public defender's office didn't just make a phone call. They came out and met with us personally. They did briefing trainings to the officers. Instead of just sending a PowerPoint, they came out personally and met with the officers to more humanize the public defender's office. And they even went a step further and went on a ride along with our department, all of which were very positive experiences.
And one thing I'll just add briefly, something that Ellen kind of glossed over, but I think that was important, which is this roundtable. And so this is a table that often doesn't happen, where you have members of law enforcement with members of the court, with members of the public defender, with members of probation, in a task force and having conversations about issues that come up, right? And so to have that space to even bring a program to be considered by all the members gives the opportunity for the police chief to say, hey, we're interested in that. How would that look? And to go a little bit further. And so I think that part of this was to have a forum in which these things can be discussed and come up, which generally hasn't existed historically. And so I think that's an important element on how you get to this place as well. Because without that, there isn't the ride along. Without that, there aren't these subsequent things that happen. And so you need to have a space where everyone who is in the justice system, the interests do converge at certain places. And if you can kind of figure out where those are, I think you can get to places like this.
So even with these roundtables and these great sort of relationships that you all started developing, you had a different experience with setting this up with the Antioch department than you did with the Richmond department, and you had to work through them a little differently. So can you speak to sort of what those differences were and how you worked through them?
Sure. I'd like to say Diane and her staff kind of spoiled us. And so when we went to set up our second program, things were a little different. It's a larger department, and they have, in Richmond, which is in western Contra Costa County, and they have maybe more programs running in the department. So it took a little longer to get that kind of top-down messaging with the Richmond, with the West County Police Department. And we had to have some additional meetings and training bulletins out there. It just took a little longer for things to take, but we were able to work through that as well. It was a good lesson for us. We're hoping to expand to a third police agency sometime next year, and so it was helpful for us to know that every relationship's going to be a little different, and sometimes it's important to just keep the communication up and have these repeated attempts. It's we have been going into both police departments and doing briefings or trainings like Diane mentioned. So those have ranged from the beginning of when when officers go on shift. So 6 a.m. or 10 p.m. So we got a real newfound respect for some of the scheduling involved as well.
And can you speak to, I believe you have weekly meetings with the district attorney's office in one of the sites and how that relationship is working, and what you're doing with those meetings?
Sure. We've really been trying to bring our local district attorney into these programs and work closely with them as well. And one of the ideas is that, if we can catch some of these cases upstream and maybe even have conferences or discussions about them pre-arraignment, we can work on diverting cases out of the system. There are cases that we request not be filed, and then other cases we can maybe resolve where that's appropriate at the first court appearance at the arraignment date. So with our Richmond program, they actually have a district attorney that sits inside of the police department and is embedded there, and he's a relatively senior district attorney, so we've been able to work closely with him and have these conferences every other week where we're working out cases and trying to resolve them. It's been really helpful. We've had several cases where people are cited, but there's, someone's used another person's ID, and he's been able to help us submit petitions to our State Department of Justice and have factual innocence declared on those cases and get them resolved really early in the process. So it's been beneficial in a variety of different cases.
And Diane, were your rank and file officers very receptive to doing this, or did it take a little bit of conversation and back and forth to let sort of it trickle down and everyone get on board?
No, I think they were a little bit hesitant when I first told them that the public defender's office was coming to their briefing. But after they met them, it's true, after they met them, it was really fast and easy to get this program going, because like I said, it's not unreasonable. When an officer has worked a 12-hour shift and then they have to go to court, and so they have the potential to be up to 16, 18 hours and have to go back to bed to go to court and have the defendant not appear, it's pretty frustrating. For us to pull an officer off of the street to go to court when there are victims waiting for that officer and they have to wait an additional 3 to 4 hours for them to show up, and then the defendant is not at court, it's frustrating. When an officer has to find childcare on their day off to go to court to have the defendant not show up, it's frustrating. So this program is a win-win for everybody.
And can I just add, one of the really interesting things was from that first briefing in Antioch, from the line officers that are out there and that are monitoring the cases where they cite people, they knew exactly what was happening. They told us, these cases go over to the district attorney's office and they're not filed by the date on citation. So they were able to identify the failure to appear issue right from the get-go.
So Dante, can you tell us a little bit about how the Antioch program was initially funded, and then you have the funding which is a little different for the Richmond site, and how some of this work is going to be continued after that funding is no longer there?
Certainly. So, so at the Office of Reentry and Justice, we definitely work with all of the justice system partners, and it's interesting work because a lot of these conversations, as I said earlier, haven't happened in the past. And as Diane said, when you try to bring some of these new things in, there is some skepticism at times, and the reality is that we see our role as really trying to improve the justice system, trying to do better tomorrow than we are today. And the truth is, you can't improve things if you don't do things differently in some way. If you do it the same way, you can kind of expect the same result. And so we were lucky in California to some extent to be kind of provided this opportunity where our justice systems had to kind of, locally take a look at what they were doing with AB 109, which changed the way in which California local justice systems work in terms of a certain level of felonies. Instead of going to state prison, they'd be, kept locally. And so local justice systems had to say, okay, now how are we going to approach our administration of justice locally? And so some state funding came with that, and the 58 counties in California, they were all kind of given carte blanche opportunity to do it the way that they wanted to. And so with this, we've been, lucky to be able to kind of bring our partners together and think about innovations in our system, and we made a number of them, and they haven't all been easy conversations. And so as we're thinking about, but what this also does is it allows you opportunities to bring up issues and say, so where are some of the pressure points in the system and decision points in which we might be able to do something differently. And this is how this conversation about failure to appear rates comes in. The court comes and says, yeah, we hate that when we're ready to go forward, the people aren't there, someone's not there, or the DA comes in and says, we're getting these citations, and we're trying to keep up and what have you. And so everyone's kind of talking about the same thing in different ways. And so we figure out a process in which to try and pilot programs. And so we were able to use that funding to say, hey, we want to have this program. What do you think about doing it in Richmond? And then Antioch says, well, what about us? We'll do it, and we can tell you yes right now. So that's kind of how that got started. And in terms of kind of going forward, I think there's two things that are likely going to happen. Well, first off, in piloting a program, you actually see what it needs to go forward, right? So you get an accurate estimate of what it takes. And what I can tell you is, while we've made significant changes in terms of their effectiveness, the cost hasn't been that high, right? Because essentially it's a function that you're already doing and you're just doing it slightly different. And so the ability to expand, like we've said, we're already thinking of expanding this to another city in our county, and then hopefully possibly to the way in which the entire county is handling this process. And so on the one hand, you actually see that some of these changes are actually cost effective in what they produce versus what they cost. The second thing is that, we're also really, it kind of fits in this same mantra of thinking about justice reinvestment, right? So are there ways in which you can make these changes to actually create efficiencies with effectiveness within our justice system, and are there ways to actually reallocate some of the way the expenses are happening? Part of the project that comes with the DOJ side of it, which is the second part of the program, is to actually look at some of this, right? To look at cost savings and look at opportunities to reinvest the money. So going forward, we're hoping to use that information to do reinvestment, but then also, looking at ways to expand it countywide, and maybe to move some of our own resources within the county to keep that going.
So can you all sort of speak to, we've talked about how this is funded and how some of these relationships work, but what you all sort of really see as the other side of what the value is for having a program like this. I would think that you all sort of sit in different seats and you may evaluate what the value is a little differently. And I'd be curious, from a law enforcement perspective, from someone who's sort of involved in the planning, and then from the defense side, why you think this is important and how you see it as a value to sort of your individual stakeholder group.
I think for us, a lot of it, there's so many different levels that this is a value. Number one is time. Number two is money. But number three, ultimately, if there are repeat offenders that we're dealing with on a daily or a weekly basis that take up the majority of our officers' time, if we can get them early representation and we don't have to deal with them again or as much or as often, that is huge for the police department.
And from the public defender side, I think there are two pieces of it that are really important. The first is that for years, on our misdemeanor calendar, we would appear with people just from the first appearance. And often what that looked like is someone in custody on a low-level misdemeanor case, and they didn't really understand why they were there. Maybe they had gone to court when they were first cited, nothing had been filed, charges were filed later, and they hadn't received notice that charges were filed, and they were, driving their kid to school, 6 to 10 months later, they were picked up on this warrant they didn't know they had for maybe petty theft or vandalism or some other low-level misdemeanor, and this impacted their life in such a substantial way. I've had clients lose housing and jobs and have disruptions in their ability to care for their children, and often with these lower-level misdemeanors, these can be people that are really kind of on the cusp, and an event like this can trigger consequences that are far beyond the scope of what we're trying to address in a lower level case. And so, we were very frustrated by that and by our ability as public defenders to kind of, in those situations, sometimes judges wouldn't release people, you're dealing with people that are indigent, you're dealing with a broken system of money bail, and when you put all of those forces together, often, people would plead guilty at the first appearance on cases that we knew were defensible. And so we're trying to problem solve around that issue. And really one of the things that we've found that is so helpful is that getting to people early, that early intervention provides not only, that Sixth Amendment piece where we can really get in there and work with people on their cases, the reduction in failure to appear where we can make sure people are, make that court date and have cost savings to the system. But early intervention's been really helpful in a lot of cases in avoiding, repeated law enforcement contact and helping connect people with local social services, with mental health resources, substance use disorder, and other housing and other local services we have. So for us, that's where the need for this program kind of came from.
So from our side, we're really invested in seeing an effective justice system, and in the Office of Reentry and Justice, one of the things that we really look to is kind of these 3 C's of effectiveness. It's coordination, collaboration, and communication. And that's what we see as the benefit of this. In terms of coordination, over time, there's a number of different actors that change. You get a new DA in, maybe a new police chief, and things slightly shift, and they made sense maybe 6 years ago or 10 years ago when the policy was made, but they might not over time. And so this ability to be in communication means that we're able to actually talk about these changes that happen, new laws come in that change things, and so being able to communicate really impacts the coordination, which impacts the effectiveness. And then this other piece, collaboration, is extremely important. And the reason that it's important from our standpoint is that what ends up happening is that traditionally our justice system is extremely siloed. The police department makes the arrest, passes it off, and doesn't look at it again until it's done. When it gets to the courts, they're dealing with that part. When it gets to supervision, post-conviction, they're dealing with that part. But if we're able to have programs that are actually in collaboration, now we're outcome driven because we're in a program that's actually looking at the impact of this system on the long term and at the back end, right? So if we're looking at actually trying to reduce crime, we're able to look at different parts of the system to see if we're actually accomplishing that goal. So for us from the Office of Reentry and Justice, the impact of programs like this are that it increases effectiveness because of coordination, collaboration, and communication.
So this is really great. One of the reasons that we wanted to highlight the work here in Contra Costa County is, one, because it was initiated by them themselves. This wasn't initially started with federal funds, and sometimes things are, and sometimes things aren't. So it's a good way to look at a problem and know that there are roles for everybody. And I think the other thing is that this also sort of shows that this larger right to counsel issue and all the things that fall under that umbrella, it can be very complicated and it can become very overwhelming. But sometimes there are these low-hanging fruit that you can get everyone at the table around and sort of start with that. And now you have all these relationships developed, you have all this coordination, and you have something that everyone can look to and say, hey, this is an outcome that has been mutually beneficial for not only the person going through the system, but all of the actors that have been involved in the system. And now maybe there's something a little more complicated, or it's going to require a little more teamwork and a little more convincing, but we have these relationships of working together, so we're ready to maybe take the next challenge on. And so, we shouldn't always be focused on getting everything done right away in the first shot. There is a progression about this. This system took a long time to build, and it will take a long time to rework to a way that it's effective for the state and local needs. And so I think this is a really great project because you have every single stakeholder at the table having these conversations and playing some role, and now you're getting to see the benefits of that. So we wanted to really highlight that for all of you to see maybe how later in the day, think about maybe there's something in your jurisdiction that you could be focusing on, and then let's develop some questions and answers around, well, what would be needed to make that happen? So this is great. So thank you all so much for coming all the way here from California and talking about this project. And now we're going to have David Carroll and the Chief Justice from the Tennessee Supreme Court talk about their state and local accomplishments as well.
Thank you.
So thank you.